Welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us for this second installment of Transatlantic Talks. I'm Karen Donfried, the president of GMF, and I'm delighted that we are welcoming Derek Chollet, our Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, for this second edition. Assistant Secretary Chollet will be known to many of you. You have his full bio, and you can see what a rich set of experience he brings to this. Not only from his current position at the Department of Defense, he's also served at the White House and the State Department, as well as outside of government at the Center for New American Security and Brookings. He is one of the key senior officials preparing the NATO summit, which will take place in early September in Wales, and is fluent on collective security and collective defense, whether applied to Afghanistan or Ukraine. And he also is extremely articulate on everything from defense spending to NATO's open door policy. We really could not ask for a better person to preview the NATO summit for us. So Derek, thank you so much for being here. GMF's Transatlantic Talks pairs high-level government officials from one side of the Atlantic with senior journalists from the other side to discuss on the record the issues that are most relevant to the transatlantic relationship. And today I'm delighted that our moderator is Martin Klingst. He is the Washington bureau chief of Zeit, the influential German weekly, and he's been in this position since 2007. Sadly for us, this is Martin's last hurrah, as he'll be returning to Germany later this month. So I do need to say, Super Mario did it for Germany yesterday, and Martin's in a very good mood today because of that. But beyond his good mood, Martin is one of the most thoughtful journalists that Germany has here in Washington. So Martin, thank you so much for being here. Now, for those of you who are not in the room, you can follow the conversation on Twitter at #GMFTTalk. And we are also live streaming the event on GMF's website. Now, with pleasure, I'd like to turn the floor over to Martin and Derek.
Thank you, Karen, for your so kind words. And I think GMF could not have a better person leading this important organization at these challenging times. Mr. Assistant Secretary Chollet, did you watch the football game yesterday?
I did. But of course, this is the nature of my job. In the overtime period, I was on a conference call with the Secretary of Defense on another subject, so I had to get updated by a colleague who would give us the score every now and then. So.
Well, great. But you probably saw who attended also the game.
I did.
And the Russian president was there, though his team had left a long time ago. Any second thoughts why he was there?
Well, I'll get to that question, but first I just want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be back at the German Marshall Fund for many, many years. In and out of government. This has been an organization that I've been very involved in. I've done study trips with GMF. I've participated in many conferences around the world. And it's just a thrill for me to be back, and especially to be here with your new president, Karen Donfried, who's an old friend and a colleague. You know, when I worked with Karen and when she was at the White House, you become accustomed to whenever someone from the White House calls, you immediately answer the phone and you get to work because they're ordering you to do something. So when Karen called me, it was my instinct just to say, yes, I will be here immediately. But no, in all seriousness, Karen is one of the true leaders in our country, in the transatlantic community. She's a thought leader. She's an action leader. We miss her very much inside the government, particularly as we're leading up to the summit, which she played such a critical role in helping to shape during her time in government. So it's just, Karen, it's great to see you and to be here. So on to
Putin and
the conversation.
His game watch.
His game watch. I don't know what happened in that conversation. Of course, President Putin he's been doing travel around the region over the last several days. I know he was in Cuba. It was well before, and I think my recollection is he'll be doing a BRICS meeting that the Brazilian president will be hosting, I think today. And so we're very interested into what that conversation was like because the Chancellor has been such a critical partner of ours when it's come to Ukraine. And over the past several months, her conversations with President Putin and Germany's engagement in working with us and other partners in helping to try to bring about a resolution to this Ukraine crisis has been absolutely indispensable.
But where are we now in the Ukraine crisis?
Well, it's still a dire situation. We're seeing reports over the weekend, and including today, of continued violence in Ukraine's east. Reports of Russian forces still in significant number on the eastern side of Ukraine's border, and still separatists very active inside eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian military has seemed to get some of its footing back over the last several weeks, and we've seen some of the key cities in Ukraine's east be liberated. But this is still a huge challenge for us. It's a huge challenge for the Ukrainians. And we very much want to see an end to Russia's support for the separatists and what we consider to be its provocative actions and its escalatory actions. And so that's something I fully expect. The Chancellor had a candid conversation with President Putin about, and it's something we'll continue to work with the Germans on.
What does Putin have to do to regain trust?
Well, the Europeans and the United States have laid out several terms for Russia's behavior that we would expect to see. And among those would be a withdrawal of forces from the border, end of the support of the separatists, support of the diplomatic process that we have seen get started, but it, of course, has not made the progress we would like to see in terms of some sort of reconciliation between the separatists in the east and the Kiev government. But what we're trying to do from a defense perspective is support our Ukrainian partners, and we have over $33 million in U.S. military assistance that is going to Ukraine. That includes everything from bolstering their border security efforts to providing needed equipment and body armor, medical devices, surveillance equipment, binoculars. Because the Ukrainian military has been deployed for 6 months in its country, it's had some tough losses, and we're there to help.
Talking about trust, we're heading towards the NATO summit, and it's going to be a pivotal summit. Everyone says it's probably one of the most important summits we're going to have. And you know that trust is the basis of the alliance. And excuse me if I ask you this question as a German, but I have to. Germans talk of a severe breach of trust, you know, as the result of, first, of the surveillance of Chancellor Merkel's cell phone, and now we have a new espionage affair. So do you see this breach of trust, and what can be done to restore this breach of trust from the United States?
Well, as you would expect, I can't comment specifically on any of the allegations that are in the press on these issues. What I can say is that the U.S.-German relationship is absolutely indispensable to the United States. We are a strategic partner. That's what Secretary Kerry reiterated yesterday when he met with the Foreign Minister Steinmeier in Vienna. It's something that President Obama believes deeply. His relationship with Chancellor Merkel has been extremely important to the United States over the years.
He hasn't yet talked to her.
I don't think he's talked to her in the last couple days. I think the last call was late last week, is my recollection. I'm sure he will be talking to her in the days ahead, if nothing else to congratulate her on the World Cup, but also to talk about Ukraine. That said, we know how sensitive these issues are in Germany. I know. I spent a significant amount of time myself in Berlin. I was at the American Academy in Berlin several years ago as a fellow, and very much understand the sensitivity these issues place. So we take them very seriously, but we do have a strategic partnership with Germany. We have a very close defense partnership with Germany. It's Secretary Hagel and his defense counterparts over the last years have talked about many of the most sensitive issues to our two countries and most difficult issues that our countries face, whether it's the future of NATO or Ukraine or Syria and Iraq. These are very important issues. We need Germany as a strong partner. That trust is very important to us.
So you can understand when Germans say enough is enough?
Well, I can understand the sensitivity, but all I can say is that from the perspective of somebody who every day has to work these issues with our German partners, we believe very strongly in the relationship. We believe very strongly in being as open as we can be, and we also believe that we need Germany to help us on so many critical issues, whether it's Europe or whether it's increasingly the Middle East, or whether it's dealing with the shared threats that both of our countries face, but also the opportunities that we have to help make the world a little bit safer.
Let's turn to the future of NATO. When we face this summit, After '89, you know, NATO was looking for a new job, looking more for crisis management and the export of security, and no one really thought that the old challenges would come back, like the defense of territorial integrity. Now it's back with the Ukraine crisis. Have you ever thought it would come back that quickly?
Well, I think to me it's less of challenges coming back, because I think those challenges were always with us, and the challenges have also evolved. I see NATO as it's approaching what I consider its fourth phase, and all summits are important, as you suggested, but this summit does feel to be critically important right now, and we're at an inflection point for the alliance. First phase of NATO post-World War II, where we knew what NATO's mission was, right, to stand up to the Soviets. The second phase, after the end of the Cold War, when many people in the transatlantic community, many people in Washington, thought it's time for NATO to fold up. Mission accomplished. There's no longer a need to have NATO. And we had this existential issue of what is the alliance for. We answered it in many ways, one of which was enlargement, which again, at the time, was extremely controversial. Anyone who considered themselves a serious foreign policy thinker in Washington was against enlargement. But it was a decision that was, I think, worth taking, and we've seen the fruits of enlargement even most recently. The third phase, post 9/11, where NATO again was asked to step up after an initial bit of turbulence in terms of whether or not NATO would be playing a role in Afghanistan, but it was, of course, the first time Article 5 has been invoked, and NATO has been an absolutely indispensable part of the effort in Afghanistan, and I think also, not just as an alliance member, but the way we've plugged in partners in the Afghanistan effort. So as we are approaching the end of this year and into next year, with Afghanistan transitioning to a train, advise, and assist mission, we're once again facing, for the alliance, a moment where we're asking, what is the alliance for? Now, this was a moment Karen and I saw coming before the Ukraine crisis erupted, but the Ukraine crisis has, of course, brought right up front and center many of the core issues that the alliance is facing. That includes capabilities, and the capabilities that our alliance partners have.
And is NATO prepared for that?
Well, that's an evolving question. I mean, I think we have seen some examples, most recently, of countries stepping up to say that they are willing to spend, for example, more than 2% of their, or 2% or more of their GDP on defense.
Is money the pivotal question, or is it more efficiency?
It's both. It's both. Money is important. I think resources are important. It's also how you spend those resources.
But you know that most European countries, you know, are still suffering under the euro crisis, so there won't be much more money to spend.
Yes, absolutely, and we're aware of that because we have our own budget woes here at home. So what we're trying to do, and what NATO's been trying to do over the last several years, is to find ways that we can encourage countries to make the tough political decision to spend more resources on their defense, particularly at a moment where the needs are very clear and many partners are stepping up, but also to try to find ways and work with them to make sure that their spending is smart. That's what smart defense is all about, and that we can leverage one another and so that we are together more capable.
Do you think you have common ground for the future of NATO inside NATO? Because you know, you see a big gap between the southern countries and the eastern countries. The eastern countries look more towards Russia and are more afraid about territorial integrity and defense, while the southern countries look more towards the Near and the Middle East and are more interested in crisis management. So you have two different views for the future. How do you bridge that gap?
So I wouldn't describe it as a gap. I think there is a difference in emphasis depending on geographically where one sits. I was in Italy last month and heard very clearly from our Italian colleagues their concerns about threats from the south. And they, of course, are dealing with a very dire migration problem coming up, particularly from Libya. The United States is very focused on threats from the south, and we rely very much on our NATO partners, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, for access, for cooperative efforts as we're dealing in the range of problems in North Africa. But we're also focused on the East. So the alliance has to be able to work both problems, and it's not either or, certainly.
What can you do to get more mutual understanding of the diverse problems?
Well, first, we talk about them all the time, and it's not an either or situation where we're either focused on the East or the South. We have to, of course, be focused on both. The United States is focused on both. Many of our core NATO partners. France and the UK in particular are focused on both. So we're attentive to both sides' needs. This European Reassurance Initiative that President Obama announced during his trip to Europe in June, $1 billion of new money that we can use to help work with our European partners on things like exercises and some infrastructure reform and to help a U.S. troop presence. That's going to be principally to the Central and Eastern European allies in dealing with the East, but we'll also be focusing on the South as well. Well,
Russia will remain the elephant in the room, also at the summit in Wales. Mm-hmm. So what can you do to actually, in a strategic perspective, to cooperate with Russia? You know, you have also this diversity of opinions in NATO. You know, some would like a tougher role, and others would like to continue cooperation with Russia, especially the Germans. And I hear sometimes in the United States that some people say, okay, the Germans are turning towards a middle of the road way, you know, just equal distance to the United States and Russia. You hear those fears. So what would you advise, you know, to do with Russia? And Russia is the biggest force in Europe, and a strategic concept cannot, you know, just avoid Russia.
You've pointed out a real challenge for the alliance. Over the last 20 years, since the end of the Cold War, NATO has worked to create mechanisms to build deeper cooperation with Russia, the NATO-Russia Council being one of them. Most of those mechanisms, alliance-wide, but also the mechanisms the United States helped create, have been put on hold given the crisis in Ukraine. And I think that whereas it's clear that Russia right now is not interested in being a partner of NATO's, it's not really much interested in being a partner of the United States, obviously we still need to seek areas where there could be common interest and common understanding. Despite the fact that we've had deep differences on Ukraine, we've continued, the United States and European partners have continued to cooperate with Russia on issues like Iran, on issues like the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. So there are examples where we find that we can come together. But I do think that one of the challenges we face as an alliance is looking at a Russia that, whereas we do not consider Russia an adversary, I think it's safe to assume that many in Russia, including perhaps even the leader of Russia, considers NATO an adversary. And what the reality is for us, given that moving forward, is very difficult.
But do you think there will be some kind of discussion? Well, discussion will there be, of course, but kind of new strategy that's trying to deal with Russia?
I don't anticipate a Russia-specific strategy. One of the discussions that leaders will have at the summit is NATO strategy writ large, and what is the alliance? How does the alliance look at all of these various challenges that it's facing, whether it's the future of Afghanistan or what's going on in the East in Russia, to the South and the instability in North Africa, to threats that know no state boundary like cyber. How we as an alliance grapple with those threats collectively will be the key topic, but I don't anticipate a specific Russia strategy.
But still you have, you know, countries developing totally different defense strategies. The Dutch just got rid of their tanks, while the Poles just ordered 250 Leopard tanks from Germany. So it seems to be, you know, a non-bridgeable gap. What do you do?
Well, part of the reason why we have NATO and why we spend so much time working through NATO at the ministers' level and at my level and below is to try to coordinate as much as possible on our defense strategies, so we do have a common picture of the threat and the opportunities and the needs that we all share. That said, nations make sovereign decisions. They have their own defense strategies. They have their own defense budgets. We try to encourage them where we can to make decisions we think are in their interest and in our collective interest. I think we've made some progress. I think there are examples in which we've reduced some duplication in the alliance, and we've shown that we can work together. That's one of the things in Afghanistan, I think, as we're closing out this phase we're in Afghanistan, transitioning to the train and advise and assist mission, it should be noted that NATO has been at war for a better part of a decade in Afghanistan, and we've learned a lot in that process.
What have you learned?
Well, we've learned how to operate together. We've learned some hard lessons. about what not to do in some cases. We've learned
what shouldn't you do?
We've learned some sort of equipment. I mean, in terms of procurement and duplication. We've learned how important things like ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, would be for the future of the alliance. Those are lessons we're trying to apply in NATO moving forward, but one of the challenges we will have is how you continue to keep those muscles strong that were developed over 10 plus years of fighting together in an environment where you're not fighting a war. Right. So that will be a challenge for the alliance moving forward.
One final question before I turn to the audience. One threat that everyone talks about but not much is done about is cybersecurity. So we have not, everyone is fearing a huge cyber attack one of these days, but as far as I know, Article 5 cannot be yet invoked when there is a cyber attack. So what needs to be done, and how does this problem needs to be tackled?
I'm glad you raised it. Cyber is an issue, as you all know, the United States has focused quite a bit on. In the last few years, we created a cyber command in the Defense Department, and we've had a national cyber strategy that the White House put out. We've also sought to bring cyber more into the conversation at NATO, and there's been several NATO defense ministerial sessions on the cyber issue and ways that we can both increase NATO's own capacity as an institution on cyber defense, but also work with NATO partners to increase their cyber defense. Of course, some of our NATO partners, I'm thinking of Estonia, have been the subject of a pretty serious cyber attack over the years. So I think there's a wide awareness within the alliance of how critical this issue is, but many of these issues, in particular on cyber, because of the boundaries that they cross between domestic and foreign and the legal regime around it, are very tricky for many of our partners. I do think, though, that the investment NATO's put into cyber is important, but we need to do more. I remember Secretary Hagel's first meeting as Secretary of Defense with Secretary General Rasmussen in the spring of last year. It happened to be the same day that Senator Lautenberg had passed away, and Senator Lautenberg had been a colleague of Secretary Hagel's in the U.S. Senate. And Secretary Hagel made this comment to the Secretary General Rasmussen saying, my colleague Frank Lautenberg, who was the last surviving World War II veteran in the Senate, had passed away. And that symbolizes, in many ways, the challenge we face, because we're passing from the World War II generation to this next generation, and for NATO to continue to be seen as relevant to our publics, to the American people, to the German people, it needs to be seen as addressing the issues, the security issues that are relevant to these publics. So that's why, as an alliance, we need to work harder on those issues.
You see, you need to work harder. Lots needs to be done, but what specifically needs to be done?
Well, I think, again, building the NATO capacity inherently, or its indigenous capacity as an alliance, is very important, and that's something the alliance has taken baby steps towards. I think having a NATO strategy on cyber, an alliance-wide strategy, is something that we would be interested in, and also leveraging one another's cyber defense capabilities. So we're not just all developing these capabilities within our respective stovepipes or cylinders of excellence.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to turn to your questions, and please briefly identify yourself, and please keep it to a question. First.
My name is James Kritschik. I'm with the Foreign Policy Initiative. You said that Russia is not an adversary of the United States or NATO. What would it have to do to become one? Because from my end, it looks like from the Arctic to Venezuela and everything in between, they are out to stymie the United States. They're hosting the biggest thief of American intelligence information. So what else would they have to do to earn that badge of honor?
Well, I think I don't want to get into speculating where Russia could go, what line there is to cross to become an adversary or an enemy. I think it's quite clear that Russia's behavior across a whole range of issues, as you mentioned a few of them, is not consistent with our interests. It's something that we have a big problem with, and that's one of the reasons why the U.S.-Russia relationship is more or less put on hold. Certainly from a defense perspective, we've ceased all interactions with the Russian military, and unless it's some urgent operational issue, we don't talk much with the Russian military, and I think that's really true across the board in our government. Of course, there's a necessity of diplomacy that we have leader-to-leader talks. And I think, though, in the past, even in the course of this administration, we have seen examples in which the United States and Russia can work together, and we can have a different kind of relationship I mentioned two of the most important in the last 6 months, the Iran issue and the Syria issue. There are other issues where we have worked together. But we've also saw it over not just in this administration, but the previous several administrations, both Bush and Clinton, to find ways to make Russia even more of a partner and to think of creative ideas that we could work together, whether it be in the military realm or otherwise. And I think right now our thinking is on hold. Right, we're waiting to see how willing Russia is to be a partner of ours. But I'm still holding out hope that there could be a change in Russia's behavior. I think certainly we're trying to seek to incentivize them to make those changes. But we have to be realistic about the way forward, certainly.
What are those incentives?
Well, certainly Russia's felt a little bit of a pinch economically, given the sanctions have been put on place in the response to its behavior regarding Ukraine. You have seen an impact on the Russian economy, and the president's been very clear that if Russia's behavior doesn't change, he's prepared to take additional steps, and if necessary, on our own.
Excuse me, the microphone front here, please.
And
then we go to the right.
Ambassador.
You all get your
I
questions.
just wondered if you could elaborate more on the process of preparing the $1 billion package at the Pentagon and how technically it will continue in the Congress, and what sort of support do you feel in the Congress for the initiative?
Well, Ambassador, thanks for the question. It's great to see you. He was asking about the European Reassurance Initiative, and we have formally asked the Congress for its support in that initiative. So far, I can say that it's been a positive reception, as you all well know in this room. Congress, many in Congress are very supportive of our relationships in Europe, and particularly Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm hopeful that we will not find any roadblocks on the way through this process. But so far, it's been quite good. Until we have approval, it's hard to get into specific details about exactly what we will be working with partners like your countries on, because until we have the money, we can't scope exactly what those will be. But we have ideas, and we have been talking with you about some of those ideas. Some of that will be a continuity on what you've already all seen in the last several months in terms of U.S. activity.
And any new ideas?
There are some new ideas.
And?
There are some new ideas. So one of them it's not new because we do it elsewhere, but it's new in that it was not contemplated before. It was prepositioning of equipment in some places, additional exercises, additional rotational presence. We have an existing rotational presence in several places throughout Europe, but there are other places that could expand too.
But no permanent presence?
That's not something we're talking about now, but we like to think of it as a persistent presence. It's troops forces and activities that would be rotated through on a regular basis that would enable us to work very closely with partners, bring up partner capabilities, but then avoid the major cost of a new footprint on the continent.
Thank you. Please, the microphone here in the front row. This lady in the blue shirt.
Thank you. It's great to be at the German Marshall Fund the day after the World Cup. Congratulations. My name is Lorelei Kelly. I'm at the Open Technology Institute, New America Foundation. I am somebody who, you could only say this as a wonk in Washington, but this is sort of NATO's year to really shine. It seems to me that for the last 10 years, NATO has evolved from being a military political organization to a political military organization. In many ways, I worked on the Hill forever. I think Congress is probably ready to hear this now in a way that it wasn't a decade ago. It seems that you said we need to reimagine sovereignty. We need to reimagine all of these tools like confidence building measures, everything in a world that no longer has these definitions. But the problem we're facing everywhere is that we're being outgoverned by eliminationists or ideologies that aren't interested in the same things we are. My question for you, Derek, also for your comments is, who do you see are our best allies right now that aren't inside government? Because this isn't a problem or a challenge that governments and state-to-state actors can solve. Is it going to be private sector? Is it going to be these massive NGOs. What do you think? Where do you see the hopeful spots?
Thank you. Derek.
That's a great question, Lorelei. I should say, I think Lorelei and I were on a German Marshall Fund study, Manfred Werner seminar. That's right, many years ago at NATO.
Old friends here.
That's right, exactly. That was not a planted question. It's a really good question. I mean, I don't have anything incredibly insightful to say. I think definitely the private sector, definitely NGOs. And when I say the private sector, also my thought is it's that cutting edge private sector folks. New technology folks would be the ones I would think would be the most active and the ones that would probably have the reach we were looking for. And this gives me something to work on, because I think that it seems to me, at least from where I sit from a defense perspective, and I don't attend foreign ministerial, so I don't know if this may be different in a NATO foreign ministerial, that we could do better bringing in the private sector into these conversations. Because one thing that's clear to me, having sat through a lot of these meetings at NATO, is when defense ministers get around a table, it actually is kind of easy to agree on many things. So we can all sit around the table at a defense ministerial and say, we need to do better on our defense budgets. I mean, even the United States will say that, given what we went through last year with sequester. But it's how this then plays out back home and the politics of this issue, where it's easy for defense ministers to get together and agree, but then they got to go back and deal with budget ministers and finance ministers and publics. And so we've been struggling with ways to how to widen that conversation on capabilities and defense spending, for example. So Secretary Hagel proposed in a speech last year, or earlier this year, maybe at an upcoming defense ministerial, including finance ministers at the meeting, just so they could sit and hear the conversation of defense ministers to hopefully, in terms of our bureaucracies, create allies when everyone goes back to capitals to try to advocate for this or that. But I think we should be probably push the creativity envelope a little bit more and include folks from outside government.
Maybe for the audience, when you talk about cooperation with NGOs, about whom do you think?
Well, which NGOs?
Yes.
Well, I don't want to. If I start naming some of them, undoubtedly, of course, German Marshall Fund. I mean, that was. But I mean, there is a very robust network of NGOs that focus on transatlantic relations. But then also NGOs that focus, like service NGOs, that actually are in the field trying to help folks, that we could maybe try to leverage their capabilities and knowledge as well.
Okay, thank you. Esther.
Thank you very much. Esther Brimmer, George Washington
Good
University.
To see you,
Good
Esther.
to see you
Good
both.
to see you,
Good
Esther.
both. Thank you. And thank you to the German Marshall Fund and to Karen for hosting this. If I may ask two questions about ongoing political developments this year. The first is to follow up again on nuclear nonproliferation, the importance of the P5+1 talks. Of course, the United States, Germany, Russia, and others participate. And could you comment a bit on the Iran issue and how that plays into NATO's thinking? The second is this September, the United Kingdom will host a referendum. Scotland will decide what its future will be after 300 years within the United Kingdom. Of course, that's part of NATO's northern border. Could you comment on that as well? Thank you.
Thanks, Esther.
Scotland would be new NATO member.
That's so on the second one first, because I can dispense with that relatively easy. We don't have a position on the referendum. All I can say is the UK, as you noted, is a critical defense partner of ours. We rely on the United Kingdom quite a bit. So we are watching the referendum very closely and very curious about the outcome and what the effect may be on us, but we have been careful not to interfere in UK politics and take a position. On the Iran issue, I have to say from a NATO perspective, it has not come up much, although, as you noted, we work very closely with key countries that are NATO allies, but it's not something we talk about in a NATO context. If I could just though take the opportunity to say that although the diplomatic track is what is in the news right now, and it's something that we very much hope we see success, although I think, as the president himself has noted, it's better, 50-50 chance at best whether this works, but Secretary Kerry, Bill Burns, Wendy Sherman are all there working this quite hard in Vienna as we speak. From a defense perspective, not much has changed regarding Iran, and nothing we've been asked to do nothing differently in terms of our posture, our planning, and our efforts as a result of even the modest success we've seen at this point on the Iran nuclear negotiations. And so we still remain very focused on the Iranian threat, not just the nuclear file, but also other dimensions of Iran's behavior, whether it be its conventional proliferation, whether it be its support for extremists, or its efforts to undermine allies of ours in the region. So from a defense perspective, it's been very steady as she goes.
So there are 6 more days to go till the deadline.
That's right.
So what are the biggest obstacles on the way there?
Well, I'm going to have to pass on that because I'm not in Vienna. I'm not at those negotiations. I mean, I think the obstacles are pretty clear in terms of the overall negotiation itself, but where we stand today, I don't know.
There was one more question, and then I turn to the...
My name's Dave Pollack. I'm at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
It's like old home day.
Yeah.
It's like, this is
Yes, Derek. So it won't surprise you if I ask, what role, if any, do you see for NATO or for European partners of the United States in Syria, in Iraq, and in the Israeli-Palestinian arena?
Thanks.
And is this going to be a significant topic at the upcoming NATO summit? Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Dave.
very much for this
Thanks,
good
Dave.
question.
So again, like Iran, Syria and Iraq and Middle East have not come up much in NATO meetings, but as you're well aware, it's a topic we discuss quite a bit when we're at NATO meetings, inside meetings. So, for example, at a defense ministerial a year ago, we had a Syria meeting, but it was not part of the formal NATO session, but with the Brits and the French and the Canadians and the Germans. Look, I think whether it's Syria or Iraq, and you think of those as one contiguous problem, roughly 20,000, I think, Sunnis right now, whether it's in eastern Syria or western Iraq, who are living in essentially a non-state. And the threats coming out of that part of the world that emanate up into Europe, but then, of course, across the Atlantic, are something that is genuinely a collective security problem. So whereas I don't know that it will ever be a NATO solution, it certainly will be something that the United States and Europe will need to work on together. We have, of course, worked with our European partners in Syria, for example, on the chemical weapons destruction, which was truly a multilateral international effort from Danish and Norwegian ships to Italian ports and Spanish ports to American ships to Russian forces helping get the material out, and that makes us all safer. So it's hard for me to conjure up any single policy that we would pursue on the Iraq-Syria problem that would not involve our European partners. And that's a conversation, though, that's very difficult, I think, for some of our European partners to have because it is such a big problem. But I know there's an appetite here in the United States and in our government to have our European partners step up and play an even larger role.
Well, when you mention Syria and Iraq, it comes to my mind Bosnia. In Bosnia, NATO helped to avoid genocide or humanitarian crises. This does not seem to happen in the newer conflicts. And does that lead to the consequence that you have to look at 2 crises with 4 different eyes?
Yes, I mean this is you rightly point out the NATO's critical role in 1995 in helping bring peace to Bosnia. Of course, that was unfortunately preceded by several years of inaction. And that is an experience that haunts many of us who came of age during those years when NATO did act with force. When we have a situation like what's going on in Syria or even in Iraq, it is very difficult to watch. But there are no easy answers, and it's something that we've worked on very, very hard. And NATO has stepped up. I guess I want to amend my one comment to Dave because I just thought of the one area where NATO stepped up is in defense of Turkey. And it's a NATO mission to have Patriot batteries deployed, and it's German and US and Dutch Patriots that are deployed in Turkey, and they've been there for about a year and a half. So there are examples where NATO can take action, but clearly when we think of this problem and how it's metastasized over the last several years and where it could go, it's hard to find much good news there. And I think it's clear the United States has a special role to play, and we have been trying to play that role, whether it be with our European partners or on our own, to try to build up close partners like Jordan, for example. But we all collectively, I think, have to do more.
This gentleman also raised the question about Gaza. So what can NATO or the international community do about Gaza? I recall that Obama said that his government cooperated in defense issues more strongly than any of the previous governments. But it does not lead actually to any peace in the Near East. So what can NATO and what can the alliance do to help mitigate this conflict?
It's very difficult. It's not been an issue that has been raised in a NATO context, and to be honest, few of our European partners are really actively involved in this effort right now. The United States, of course, has a very close relationship with Israel, very close defense relationship with Israel. It's a relationship I personally spend a lot of my time on, and we have seen the benefits of that relationship unfold in the last week, particularly in the realm of missile defense, and whether it be Iron Dome or Arrow, which have both been deployed in the last several days as rockets have flown out of Gaza into Tel Aviv. So right now, Secretary Kerry, even though he's engaged in Vienna, has also been on the phone quite a bit to Israel and to other partners around the region to try to bring about some sort of ceasefire. But and I think all I would say is I would hope and think that our European partners would be also working toward that. But it's a very difficult situation where both sides, at least as of this morning when I checked in on it, seemed unwilling to step down. Is
there any chance to revive the peace process?
Well, sure. I mean, the peace process has been declared dead many, many, many times over the last 25 years. So although things look quite grim right now, I never hold out hope that something could emerge out of this crisis, but I think we have to be realistic in that right now the challenge is to try to get rockets stop flying out of Gaza, stop rockets flying out of Gaza, and to get some kind of ceasefire underway.
Right, but there's a disparity of casualties on both sides so far.
There is, but there's been a lot of challenges coming out of Gaza in particular, and what we've seen, and I think is very concerning to our Israeli partners, they've told me about, is the evolution of the missile threat coming from Gaza even since November, December of 2012. So it's something that Israel is very focused on, as are we.
Thank you. Sir. Microphone here, this gentleman.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Following up on Professor Brimmer's question about the United Kingdom, which has been our major ally in overseas operation. 4 years of cuts by the Conservative government have left the UK with an army that's now the smallest since the Napoleonic Wars, and the question of whether it can project power much beyond the English Channel. You and your secretary have used pretty soothing rhetoric talking about bolstering NATO. But in reality, isn't really the harsh language of Secretary Gates's last Brussels speech what is really going on here between us and our major European allies in terms of defense capability?
Well, I think that our overall view of the challenge and the concern we have about the disparity in the Transatlantic Alliance on defense capabilities isn't any different today than it was under Secretary Gates when he presented his speech. And Secretary Hagel gave a speech at the Wilson Center earlier this year in which he didn't use the same words, but it was certainly the same themes that were articulated by Secretary Gates and then after him Secretary Panetta. And although it's absolutely true that, for example, in the United Kingdom, the defense budget has been cut significantly, it's a mixed picture. Just over the 4th of July weekend, our Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, was in the UK to help christen a new aircraft carrier that the United Kingdom was launching, and he came back quite impressed with the capabilities of that carrier, and it still remains to be true today that the British are a global partner of ours. They're one of the few countries, few partners that we have that when we sit down, we talk about global issues, whether it be Asia or the Middle East or what's going on in Europe. So yes, declining defense budgets, declining capabilities remain to be a challenge. They remain to be a problem. They remain to be something that we worry very much about, and that's why these issues have been on the agenda at NATO in ministerials. That's why they will be front and center at the summit. But we have had our own challenges here at home.
You're cutting too.
With the defense budget. We are cutting too. And some of those cuts have been cuts we've sought. We think they're the right things. Some of the cuts are cuts, frankly, we have not sought and that have been imposed upon us by our legislature. So we very much understand the political challenges here. It's one of the reasons why, by the way, the President announced the European Reassurance Initiative to show that even in the moment where we are facing severe budget pressures here at home, that the United States is still willing to invest in European security, and think of it as like a challenge pledge. We're showing that we're still willing to try to buck the political trends here and continue to spend on European security, and we expect our European partners to show the same.
What God forbid, do you still think that NATO has the capacity to confront Russia if it came to that point?
NATO has tremendous capacity. I mean, I think collectively we have shown really over the last 20 years of deployment, starting in Bosnia in 1995 through Kosovo, counter-piracy, and of course Afghanistan, that NATO has tremendous capabilities. And so I'm not worried about NATO against any single country or coalition of countries.
Okay. Gentleman there, and then I go to the back.
Gero Schließ, Deutsche Welle, German television and radio. I think this is a question. A lot of experts doubt that NATO has the capacity to confront Russia. I think in the wake of the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, we have seen, we have learned that the military force, the Russian military force, is by far superior to NATO, by far, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of technical standards, of technical abilities. So, do you think, as part of a new strategy, should NATO reconsider its role as a counterpart, as a counterweight to Russia?
Well, again, I dispute the premise of the question. Nothing in anything I have seen during my time in this job, and even in my time out of government, leads me to believe that somehow NATO is weaker vis-a-vis really any coalition of countries, let alone a single country. So that said, what we've seen in Russia, or coming out of Russia, what we've seen in Ukraine is a unique kind of use of the military, whether you call it irregular or asymmetric or hybrid kind of warfare. This is something General Breedlove, our European commander, has talked about at great length. And so that is a challenge perhaps to the alliance, because it's something that's not forces, large land forces going across a border or an air campaign. It's something that is harder to discern at times. It's also something where there's more deniability at times. And so it therefore makes it harder to have a clear response, because you're not often sure exactly what is happening. And I think that's what we've seen play out in the East, in Ukraine in particular, over the last several months. And how the alliance therefore is structured and what its capabilities are to deal with that kind of problem are something that's still a work in progress. And that is something that perhaps the alliance can work on. But I think if you look at NATO as a coalition of countries, there's nothing like it in the world. If NATO didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. And I look at the benefit that all of NATO partners, the United States, Germany, all of our 28 allies get from NATO, and there's nothing like it in the world. So I'm not worried about NATO's future in that respect. However, just as other countries adapt and think of new ways to assert their interests, NATO has to constantly be thinking about ways that it's adapting.
There was one question in the back. This lady.
Natasha Mozgovaya with the Voice of America. Actually, if possible, two questions. First, it seems that this tentative deadline for Russia to take positive steps toward de-escalation passed. So is there any framework for them to do it? And second, you mentioned American assistance to Ukraine. So last week, one of the Ukrainian officials, Andriy Paruby, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, said that we are grateful for the bulletproof vests and for the food to soldiers, but we would also prefer modern communications equipment and precision weapons. Is it on the table at all?
So I'll take the last one first, and then I'll get back to this deadline issue. So I actually had an opportunity to meet with the National Security Advisor and the then Defense Minister when I was in Kiev in early June to talk about the defense relationship and the way forward. It was just a few days before President Poroshenko was inaugurated, so the idea was now that we have a new government in Ukraine to talk about the way forward, and was when we talked about the body armor and the other equipment that we've been supplying since those talks. There's some other equipment that has not yet arrived that we are in the process of providing to them, and that includes communications equipment and also some equipment for their border security in particular, which has been a very urgent need that they have because their eastern border is relatively porous. For many, many, many years, it was not really guarded much. They were worried about their western border. So now they've got an eastern border problem, and in some cases, the eastern border is not even demarcated. So we have assistance that's been provided. We have assistance that will be provided. As you are aware, they have a very long list of assistance that they have asked for. And part of the purpose of my talks and the follow-up talks that have happened since is to work through that assistance. What I should note, though, is that Ukraine has a robust defense industry. I think it's the 6th largest exporter of defense material in the world. Of course, it's one of its largest customers, if not the largest customer, was Russia. So one of the things we talked about when I was in Kiev was the fact that if they're going to lose their largest customer, and they have ceased their export of material to Russia, what is that going to do for their economy in ways that the West may be able to help them with that, because I think it's upwards of 40,000 jobs, mainly in the East. So in that sense, Ukraine, although it certainly has needed assistance and we've been happy to provide that assistance, I think over time it's a country that is capable of taking care of itself as well, and we want to very much help it do that. In terms of the sanctions issue, there have been several deadlines that have been set and then passed. Of course, some of those were met with sanctions, additional sanctions by the United States and our European partners. I think now that all of our countries are in the process of sorting out the next step, I believe on Wednesday of this week, the European leaders will be getting together for what will probably be the last meeting they'll have in the summer, and that will actually be a very critical moment for the conversation in terms of the way forward and what to do with sanctions.
Are sanctions the modern tool for warfare?
Well, sanctions are clearly a critical tool. It's not new that sanctions can be used to try to influence behavior. Over many years, we've tried to institute
But the Treasury
sanctions.
has a whole department working on that.
Sure. Our ability to refine the sanctions, to make them very specific towards individuals, towards entities, has grown quite a bit over the last decade or so. And of course, our Treasury colleagues are leading that effort, and we work very closely with them.
Thank you. Sir. Just wait for the micro, please.
Ukraine has two components.
Could you identify yourself?
Oda Aberdeen, the capital trust. Ukraine has two components. There's a defense military component, and there is an economic component. Now, if Ukraine fails economically, it'll be a victory for Putin. How does the US and Europe make sure that the Ukraine becomes a Poland? The West can't afford to see Ukraine fail economically.
Completely agree, and I think you have put your finger on what is the key issue, which is the Ukrainian economy. That's why the U.S. stepped up several months ago in terms of a loan guarantee for Ukraine. We've worked hard with the IMF on their assistance to Ukraine. We've encouraged, and Ukraine has decided to sign the EU accession agreement, which is something, of course, was the spark for this very crisis late last year. But despite all of our efforts on the defense side of the ledger and trying to work to help the Ukrainian military have the capabilities it needs, help it reform to become more professional and modern, you're absolutely right. This is going to be won or lost on the economy, which is why that's something the bulk of our energies as a government have been spent on that. And I think obviously this is where our European friends, Germany and others, are going to play a particularly critical role, because a Ukraine that is an economic basket case is a big challenge for Europe, because that's something that economically will will help or cause to weaken European economies across the board.
So back to the question I asked before, are you a little bit worried about Germany taking also an understandable role of Russia, showing greater understanding than other countries in Europe?
I worry, no. I mean, I understand Germany's relationship with Russia. It's long history and the unique role that Germany plays vis-a-vis Russia. And I think Chancellor Merkel, as I noted at the very beginning, has been an absolutely critical partner of ours and a leader on this effort, and she's shown herself to be quite firm when it comes to this problem.
So you said worries no, but it didn't show full-heartedly. So are there still reservations on your side?
No, it's not. I understand that Germany's got its own history and its own relationship. It's not something I'm worried about. It's not something I'm hesitant about. It's just a reality that we deal with, and that's why we're trying to be very closely aligned with the Germans across the board and make sure that whatever steps we take, whether it's a step to help the Ukrainians, whether it's a step to reassure our Central or Eastern European partners, or whether it's a step to punish Russia, that we're more powerful if we're making those steps together.
This gentleman over there. The micro for.
Thank you. Khan with Hong Kong Phoenix Television. So you mentioned that the U.S. is looking for a good relationship with Russia, but Russia is saying that some of U.S. actions in Europe are rather provocative. For example, the U.S. is building 2 Aegis BMD systems in Europe, one in Poland, one in Romania. So how could you convince Russia that the U.S. is actually looking for a constructive relationship with Russia with that going on in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we work very hard to try to convince the Russians in areas like, for example, missile defense, that our efforts to cooperate with our European partners on missile defense are not about Russia. They're about threats we face from other parts of the world. We haven't succeeded fantastically at that effort. And I think, though, the best we can do is just to keep trying. One of the reasons why we set up these mechanisms at NATO to help work with the Russians was to try to show Russia that NATO was not inherently anti-Russian, and that NATO enlargement, when we have done NATO enlargement in the past, there's nothing about it that is inherently anti-Russian, and that in areas where we believe we can cooperate, we are interested in Russia being a partner. But if Russia is not interested in being a partner of ours, that's their choice to make. But we'll continue to try to both in word and deed show them that we are not interested in making them an adversary in any way. But I think in the current environment, it's been very difficult. My joke is if I wake up in the morning, it's criticized as being provocative to Russia. So I think we have to live with that and move on, because a lot of this is just politics on their side.
Was NATO maybe not provocative enough when Russia invaded Georgia? Is that the consequence, what we see today, what happened or did not happen after the invasion in Georgia?
Yeah, I don't see the linkage there. I mean, if anything, of course, there's a big debate after what happened in Crimea, whether Georgia mattered. But of course, in Crimea, or in Georgia, we had troops in Iraq, 150,000 troops in Iraq. We had many more troops in Afghanistan, and I don't think there was any connection between our force presence in and around Georgia and what Russia decided to do.
But it happened when America went to war at that time, and now you have a more war-weary president, and still Russia continues what it has done under George W. Bush. So
right. So there's no link.
Seems to be maybe it was an encouragement.
No, that's why actually you proved the point to me. There's kind of no linkage. It wasn't about us that caused Putin to decide what he did in either case. These are calculations that he made for the reasons he made them, but it wasn't somehow our move one way or another that then provoked or conveyed that he had a green light in some way to do any of this.
Final question before we do a roundup. Jackson James, please.
Jack James from Johns Hopkins. When I used to go to Brussels, I used to say there were 2 planets in the same city. One was NATO and the other one was the EU, and they don't talk to each other. Now, you're going to be in Wales. You're going to be talking about the NATO strategy. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of people in Brussels that are trying to put their act together after the election in May. Do you guys care about that? In other words, is there a high expectation that the EU is going to have a better, more effective, more resilient capacity? Does it matter who takes Cathy Ashton's place? Or does it matter at all?
So you won't be surprised to hear me say, of course it matters. It does. And I think it's interesting, actually, because I'm thinking back to my experience in the late 1990s in the Clinton administration when we were dealing with many of these same questions about the future of NATO coming out of Kosovo, and the EU was just getting kind of going on the defense realm, and there was a sense of zero sum, and we were very worried that as the EU matured that we would have a bifurcation in the kind of the EU versus NATO, and that hasn't really played out that way, and maybe it's because of the EU not on the security side not panning out the way some worried or hoped in some cases. But it certainly matters in a diplomatic way who, you mean Europe, and who is the head of EU foreign policy has mattered. And I think Ashton is showing, even as we speak in Vienna, the critical role that person can play on urgent security issues. And I think that when you look at challenges we're facing around the world, there can be, division of labor is not the right maybe going too far. It's more a matter of emphasis. And I can think of, for example, in Mali or in Libya, where the EU has border security efforts or police efforts, and NATO is not involved in an alliance, but NATO partners are involved helping build security institutions. And so you can find ways that the two organizations can leverage one or another. It's not an either or situation.
Mr. Assistant Secretary Chollet, let me ask you a final question, a roundup question. When you look at all the different conflicts and crises in the world, and then you have, for example, the Obama government also talking about the pivot to Asia. And NATO also has some agreements with Asian countries, security agreements, like with Japan. Mm-hmm. And do you see the danger of overstretching NATO, of exhausting NATO with all the challenges NATO is asked for to participate in?
Well, look, we all have these huge challenges. If you think of the arc of crisis that we've got right now, starting in northern Mali, across Libya, to Egypt, to the Sinai, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, which is not in crisis, but is not exactly doing us any favors, next door to Afghanistan, and then Pakistan. I mean, that's, unfortunately, all those countries except for Afghanistan and Pakistan are in my AOR at work, so I'm a very busy boy. But
do you ever sleep?
Well, I also have a 4-month-old, so really, actually, I don't sleep at all. So I think that, but, and then at the same time, as you noted, we have the major strategic event of the next 50 years will be in Asia, in my view, and the growth of Asia and its emergence, not just economically, which it's been emerging for a while economically, but increasingly in the security realm. And if you just look at the pure demographics, that's going to be a reality. We're all going to confront. That's not just a U.S. issue, and we talk often with our European partners about rebalancing together. It's not just a U.S. rebalance. It's got to be increasingly a transatlantic rebalance. And we have to be careful about what we do load on NATO. I mean, I think we're all overstretched because the challenges we face today demand our attention and they demand our action. And it's not, none of us, not the United States, not Germany, not the United Kingdom, can choose to say we just are not going to be involved in thinking about or trying to deal with this problem. Now that may mean we're not as involved everywhere equally, and there's going to be some places where we're going to be criticized for being too involved, and some places we're going to be criticized for not doing enough, and that's just the nature of the business. But I think we have to be careful what we do load on NATO. NATO in its past we've had these debates. Remember, there was a big debate whether NATO should ever go out of area, and out of area at that time was the Balkans in the mid-1990s. Big debate about whether NATO should be involved at all in a country like Afghanistan, which is not anywhere close to NATO territory, but yet has proven to be a very vital mission for the alliance. So I don't want to rule out places that NATO should not contemplate being involved in. One of the issues, a way this has come up in the enlargement discussion, where there was a question of should we choose to, NATO as an alliance choose to bring in a country like Australia, which has proven in Afghanistan that it is very much part of alliance efforts. It's been one of the critical allies and critical partners in Afghanistan. Now, the Australians are not asking to be in NATO, and there's been a discussion whether that is wise even for the alliance to even contemplate. I think that kind of question is worth, or debate is worth having, but I think, and whether there are certain areas that are off limits, I don't want to say those right here today, but because I do think I've seen it in my current job, we saw it at the White House, where whenever a problem comes up, almost anywhere in the world, someone will say, well, what about NATO? Why can't NATO be involved? And I think that is both a curse, because it means that there's a lot of expectations on the alliance as an institution and on alliance members, but it's also a blessing. But because there's nothing like it in the world. No one else has a NATO. China has no NATO.
Right. But isn't it the irony of history that one talks about the decline of America and a war-weary nation, and at the same time you have an abundance of conflicts and countries seeking American protection? Isn't that an irony of history?
Well, it's only an irony if you accept that there's a decline of America. I mean, in my job at the Pentagon,
it's the opposite.
I sit in meetings all day with many of you in this room, either on my own or with the Secretary of Defense, and I've never been in a single meeting where someone has asked less of us.
Thank you so much.
And so I want to leave that, and as I say to whenever I'm out of Washington talking to folks who don't do foreign policy or for a living, I say that that's both a tremendous challenge that we face as a country, because there are many problems around the world where there's an expectation the United States is going to act, but it's also a unique opportunity and a blessing that we have.
Thank you so much. I hope you find some sleep.
I want to give a very special thank you to Martin Klingst for moderating this, and for Assistant Secretary Chollet. You may not be sleeping much, but I think all of us will sleep better for knowing that someone of your caliber is serving at this very important position in the administration. And thank you so much for all you do. And thank you all for joining us.